Okay, I'm just checking that it's gone live in the main group. Nearly there. This one. And
I can see it. It looks like.
Yeah, I think we're good to go, Nicole. I just need to pin it to the top, but yeah, people will still be watching and listening. So if you would like to make a start, that would be amazing.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another JIGS session. Our session today is focusing on Lisa Breezy's Michael Jackson, The Man in Our Mirror, a reflection of our collective soul. So we've all been busy reading and studying up on this one. Lisa describes the book as a spiritual biography of Michael Jackson, which is obviously something that's quite different to a lot of other books that we've done so far, and any books that are out there as well. We just wanted to make mention of the author's note that Lisa has added. She mentioned on our book club just recently that she would like to add a note to the book, and she's actually added it into our the event page for this link. So we probably should try and attach it to some of these messages as well, so that people can find the link there and have an extra little bit of insight, I suppose, into her thoughts about the book, and it gives you a little bit more perspective, I suppose, as to why she wrote what she wrote, and how it all came to be. Just that little bit further information after the book was complete. So there's the three of us in the session today, myself, Angie, and Emma, and welcome to everybody that's on live. I can see a few people there. Rita's here ready to go, and so is Betty Lou, so that's great to see them.
Thanks for that, Nicole. Yeah, welcome everybody. So it always takes a little bit of time to set up and link the event page back to the group, etc. There were obviously some connection issues last time. I have got a new router, so fingers crossed everything should work well today. Okay, so yeah, this was a really interesting one for us, and you can see it's quite a thick book, so it took a lot of time to read, and I think this was a book that really took a lot of time to digest. It wasn't something that you could kind of skim read, or that you could kind of just work through quickly. You really had to take your time to fully appreciate and understand what Lisa was saying. There's been some discussion on the group about this book, not too much. I'm not sure a lot of people are aware of this book. I wouldn't say it's one of the more sort of commonly known ones, but that's one of the reasons that we wanted to discuss it, and to, you know, sort of introduce it to people, really get them to know about it. As Nicole said, this is described by Lisa as a spiritual biography. So what I'm going to do first of all is just really to summarize and give a little bit of background on Lisa and on her biography. So this book is kind of split into two in a sense. It starts off by sort of introducing, you know, where she grew up and her kind of physical journey to California and how that happened, how she became a fan of Michael. It also kind of introduces Michael's biography. There's a bit of normally biographies of Michael start in 1958, but you'll see this one's a little bit different. It starts kind of before that, but there's kind of the two parallel biographies, but then it kind of goes into something completely different, which is this kind of spiritual side. But before we get on to Lisa's kind of spiritual journey and the messages that she's trying to get through to us through the book, it's really important that you have a bit more of an understanding about her and her life and her biography and how she kind of gets to that point. So I'm just going to give a brief summary of that before we go into the main sort of discussion points. So from pages 75, and this is going to be a real sort of summarized version, from page 17 to 25, she starts by expressing and describing her upbringing and how she became a fan of Michael, which was when she first heard the song Billie Jean. She basically said like it just captured her. She doesn't really know why. She doesn't know where this feeling that she experienced came from. She'd never really felt anything like that before, but she just heard this song Billie Jean and it just you know, really kind of transformed her. Her interest in Michael grew from that point until she felt that she had a real passion for him and that she could relate to him and his care for the planet. So I think we can all kind of relate to that journey. You know, I think that it all started with the music for most of us. That's how our interest started. But then we did kind of grow with him, start to understand who he was, what he was about, and then our love for him actually kind of went beyond the music. On page 31, she talks about her connection with Michael, and again, from talking with lots of fans, and I know that we've discussed this in our JIGS session on numerous occasions, she really started to connect with Michael at a time when she felt very lonely, and she felt that she found in Michael, and this is a quote, a kindred spirit, after having read some of his interviews. So again, it's that kind of getting to know him as the person and thinking, yes, you know, this really represents who I am and what I believe. She says that she would write in her journal expressing her thoughts and visions of the world, and soon after she'd read something that Michael had said that was very similar to her own thoughts, and she then began to get a strong sense that one day Michael would enter her family's life. So from quite a young age, she had this connection to Michael, this very spiritual connection, which we're going to elaborate on later, but she always had that sense that Michael was actually going to become a part of her life in more than just kind of a fan sense. Now, Lisa's mum, Judy, she plays quite an important role in all of this, and she's mentioned quite a lot in the book, but the first mention of her mum is in chapter 5. Now, Lisa's mum goes to a psychic who tells her that they are all part of a past life with Michael, which is why when I said before that normally biographies about Michael start in 1958 when he was born, well, actually this one tends to kind of start before. And the very first kind of opening chapter starts with kind of Michael in well, he's actually an angel, but again, this past life is referred to a lot, so I'm going to be coming back to that. In chapter 6, Lisa finds a link between Michael and Michelangelo, which is a theory that's been shared by Dave LaChapelle, who's spoken about this. Now, Michael loved Michelangelo and was recorded quoting him, so there was obviously a connection between the two. Michael Jackson obviously felt a strong connection to Michelangelo. He's a real fan of his art, and I think he had some of his art in his home as well. Now, one of the key points, again, that's going to kind of run throughout the book and is really a focal point for understanding Lisa's journey and this spiritual connection with Michael, is Michael was often referred to as the Renaissance man. And as I said, this is going to sort of be symbolic throughout the entirety of Lisa's book. So again, we're going to come back onto that a little bit later. Page 47. Now, Lisa describes her first visit to Neverland. So at the moment, she hasn't yet moved to California, but she goes to Neverland to visit. She doesn't get to go inside at this point, but she goes to the gates, as many fans have done. She talks a lot about kind of the scenery, how beautiful and relaxing and tranquil it is. She really kind of does a great job of setting the scene. But one of the key things from her visit that's really worth mentioning is that She described seeing a woman leaving Neverland in a white van. It was a woman sort of with blonde hair in her late 30s. And again, this is something that would be really significant later in the book. So what's really great about Lisa's book is that it really does tell a story, and it does tell the story in a way to kind of keep you engaged. It is told in a chronological way, but it is actually quite gripping because there's lots of things that she mentions, and then when you go sort of further into the book and you think, oh wow, you know, that I remember that from, you know, a couple of chapters ago, and it's a little bit of a, I wouldn't say it's suspense, but you know, it's very engaging the way she tells the story. Now Lisa then moves to California, so again that has a little bit of a story behind it itself, but I'm just kind of giving you the key points at the moment. Now, one of the key things that she reaffirms throughout the book, and it's important to make a note of this here before I carry on, is that she reaffirms throughout the book that nothing is an accident. So she doesn't believe that, you know, seeing that woman come out of Neverland, she doesn't believe that was an accident. She doesn't believe that her eventually moving to California was an accident. And there's going to be lots of things that I now say that's really important for you to listen to, with this notion that Lisa doesn't believe any of this was by accident. So then on page 55, Lisa discusses the town of Solvang, which of course is sort of where Neverland was based. I think, actually, Angie, have you visited there?
Yeah, so I've been to, yes. Feedback. Solvang, Los Olivos, and Sadrones. I'm trying to think of the other names. Yeah, it's not far. They're all quite sort of, Solvang's the furthest from sort of Neverland. It's kind of going out in that way, but it's very close, and they're all really, really quaint, and she does a good description in there of them.
And she says that, you know, like when she went there, she could completely understand why Michael would choose that as his residence. Yeah, so when you hear the description from the book, it does become very clear why Michael was so drawn to that particular town to live. Then, page 57, Lisa serendipitously meets Linda, who is the woman that she saw driving out of Neverland. So she meets this woman, I believe, I did read this like 2 months ago, but I believe she met her in, I think it was a restaurant, or am I right, girls? Do you remember where she met?
I think it was the store.
I thought that was Marcy who she met in the store. But anyway, she
sorry.
Yeah, sorry. She met Linda, who she recognized being the one driving this white van. So you can see how all this is starting to kind of build up, right? Then on page 69, I'm going to read a quote here, because this is going to be like the link to the Renaissance man that I mentioned earlier. So this is a quote from Lisa. I flashed back to the time 2 years ago when I told my mum that I had visions, or at least a strong sense that Michael Jackson would enter our lives one day. Open to the possibility, she said, I guess we'll see. Not long after, she had a reading from a psychic who tells her that Michael was a prince during the Renaissance. So remember, this psychic has got no idea of, you know, what's been in Lisa's mind, what's been in Judy's mind. Judy just goes to a psychic and she's told that in a past life, Michael was a prince during the Renaissance period. She also says, interesting that he named both his sons Prince. A week later, this is still a quote, we see Michael being referred to as a Renaissance man on the TV. A week after that, we watch a news clip of him gazing at Michelangelo's David, a well-known symbol of the Renaissance. And then nearly a year later, Lisa's queuing in a supermarket, and she turns to, I believe it was a rack of magazines, and she saw a painting of Michael Jackson in a Renaissance setting while in the queue at the supermarket. So for her, all these kind of light bulbs start to go off, and she's thinking, you know, this is not a coincidence. Why does this connection between Michael and the Renaissance period, why does this keep coming up? So then Lisa's parents then moved to California. So Lisa's already there. And then Judy, who is working, so Judy's Lisa's mum, who is then working in a health food store. She then meets Marcy, who turns up at the store and says, basically, I have no idea why I'm here. I was guided here in a dream. Michael Jackson was in my dream and he guided me to this store. I've never been to this store. Like, it's not a regular place for me, but Michael guided me in a dream to this store. So Judy worked at this store, which was called the Valley Whole Life Centre, which was a healthy food store in Solvang. Now, given that Michael was a very health conscious person, his staff would often come to the store to buy products for him and for his guests at the ranch. So again, through this connection, Judy then meets Gail, who is Michael's head housekeeper. She regularly visits the store, so obviously, you know, she gets talking with her. And she also met Marvin, who was Michael's head animal trainer. Now, Lisa actually got to meet two of the animals that were sort of at Neverland. She met AJ the chimp and Brandy the baby orangutan. And something that was really lovely to read is she said that being in their presence served, and again, this is a quote, as a window into the caring soul of Michael Jackson. I could feel his love for them just by being with them. And so again, this is given a sense of Lisa and, you know, her spiritual connection with Michael. Now, then Judy gets a job at Neverland. And if you read, this is on page 84, if you read the lead up into how she gets this job, again, it's very serendipitous. She didn't really even have to go to for the job. She was almost summoned for the job. I believe through this connection with Gail, if I'm not mistaken. You know, she was told to apply for this job and she basically sort of barely even had to have an interview. So again, if you continue to look at this series of events, it is very much, thank you. Yeah, there's the pass for her. That was her pass at Neverland. And she ended up working there as a housekeeper. And I did share this on the group, but I so enjoyed this story that I am meant to share it again. So on page 89, Lisa discusses the first time that she met Michael at Neverland. And I just think it's just the most amazing story because we can all completely get a sense of what she would have felt. So she was there for about 2 weeks. And she said, you know, she was glad that Michael wasn't around at that time. She could kind of settle in and she didn't have to deal with the pressure or the nerves of having Michael there. Now, she said, well, that point came sooner than later, meeting Michael. And of course, it's when I'm all alone in the laundry room, just folding towels and having a quiet moment by myself. When here comes the superstar in his black hat and long black tresses walking by the window. I'm going to, just to keep it a bit short, I'm going to skip some bits. So he was just all by himself. I knew Gail had gone into town and I was the only one on duty. So with that, I hear him come into the back hallway and call, Gail, Gail. And I thought, oh no, I have to go out there and actually talk to him and tell him she has gone to town. Numbness set in momentarily, and I remember saying to myself, most definitely, do not say anything stupid. Err on the side of saying not enough. Do not say much, just communicate the least you have to at this moment. I took the deepest breath I think I've ever taken, and with that walked out into the hallway, which was right near the kitchen where Michael was standing. I walked out and said, Mr. Jackson, Gail has gone into town and will be back shortly. Short and sweet, I thought to myself, good going, Judy. I will never forget that first meeting. He was in a pink shirt and black pants and he had his black hat on. And when I came up to him, he looked at me and said, okay, thank you, and gave me a shy smile. And, you know, that was the first time she ever met him. And I think we can all just conjure up those nerves and excitement and everything that she would have felt having met this man, which is kind of weird. Like, she's working in his house and, you know, never having met him. I know it had only been 2 weeks, but kind of building up this pressure and the nerves and the excitement of meeting this superstar for the first time. Interestingly, she then goes on to say, this is Judy, who wrote some extracts for the book. When I think back to that moment, what comes to mind is what that must have been like for him. here's some complete stranger in his house coming up to give him information with no formal introduction. Just here I am in his house, and how does he feel about that? He simply has to trust the people who are there with him, even though he doesn't have a clue who they are. And I think that's something that, you know, people don't give enough thought to. You know, even like his house, he kind of, in some ways, had no control over that. You know, his employees and stuff, he probably a lot of the time didn't know who they were. They would just come and go and, you know, be employed by somebody else. So yeah, and I think also that's something that's really important to be said if we're ever discussing the allegations, because I'm not sure that an abuser would have random people working in their house when they're not there, who could, you know, be going in and out whatever room they want to. And, you know, anyway. Now, on page 90, Lisa says that her mum once wrote on a piece of paper, the 3 things I need in my life to be happy are kids, music, and animals. She then put it in a drawer and gave it to the universe. So again, this is part of Lisa and her mum's beliefs, that this is kind of how the universe works. You tell it what you want, and maybe one day you'll get it. But she'd actually put it in a drawer and she'd completely forgotten about it for years. And then, of course, when she eventually got this job at Neverland, I think she found that piece of paper, if I remember rightly. And like I said, she'd completely forgotten that she'd written it, but this was her life now. She was surrounded by children, surrounded by animals, and of course surrounded by Michael Jackson and his music. Now, Lisa then travels around Europe with a friend, which she felt was a real moment of enlightenment for her. She saw all these different cultures, met all these different people, and she then acquires her first job as an exercise physiologist. So something that's really important to her is health. She believes that we should really treat our bodies as a temple, and, you know, that kind of health is at least part of what creates, you know, our happiness in our lives. So she's always found that to be really important. Now, in this first job, and here's where like the serendipitous events continue. In this job, Lisa meets a guy called Brett, who they get into a conversation about his work, and it turns out that he's an artist. And when they continue the conversation, it comes to light that he was the guy who actually created that Renaissance painting with Michael that she saw on the magazine rack while she was queuing at the supermarket. So again, like, how would you even begin to start explaining this other than if there were, let's say, other forces at work? Now, for the rest of the book is from her biographical point of view. She then goes into talking about her journey with writing the book. So she kind of got together with a close friend who I believe was a journalist. They started to discuss the possibility of Lisa writing a book. She felt it was something that she wanted to do. They discussed what kind of angle they could come from, and they both said that they didn't believe that there was a book that would touch upon a spiritual biography in the way that Lisa's done. And what's really interesting is Michael died within days of Lisa deciding to write her book, and she felt it was another part of her purpose and her journey. She felt that that was a sign that now was the right time to start that journey. And then the Renaissance painting shows up again for her on an online news forum, and from then that point Michael started to connect with Lisa and sort of guided her into writing this book. And she discusses the importance, and his guidance was sort of all about, I really want you to do this. I need you to do this. I need you to get my message out there. And you have to create by feeling and not thinking. And so I think one of the most important things to mention before we now go on to talking about the rest of the content in the book is that this is not a book of facts. It's not a book given a timeline of Michael's life. It's not really a biography in a sense. It doesn't talk about his work. It's not really a factual based book. This is someone's personal journey. And so I think when you start to think of it, if you kind of have to accept it what it is. I think if you're looking for a book that just has facts and dates and times and this is what happened and then this happened, like, this book isn't about that. It's about a woman's personal spiritual journey, her biography, how her biography links in with Michael's life and the connection that she felt that they had together. So if you kind of accept it from that point of view, I think you will be in a much better position to kind of accept it for what it is. So the kind of, if we were to try and summarize the main focus on narrative for this book and essentially what Lisa is trying to get over to us, is that she's trying to say, which we're going to talk in a lot more detail, that Michael was almost a man of two worlds, if you like. So the first 25 years was Michael being completely in touch with his spirit. It was him being completely at one with the world. He was happy, he was content, he was focusing solely on just loving life, creating for the joy of creating, and therefore he created this amazing music. We all kind of fed off of his spirit and, you know, all of that, and his oneness with the world, and, you know, creating this kind of universal happiness, contentment, etc., etc. You know, that is kind of what helped him to get to the place where he enjoyed that huge success with Thriller. Now, Angie, I know that you know, I'm going to save the kind of second parallel thing that I was talking about with Michael later. I want to focus on this first. Now, Angie, you know a little bit more about this kind of spiritual side that, you know, it's well documented that this spirituality, Michael was very, very connected to that.
Yeah. Yes. Do you want me to just go through generally sort of around spirit?
I think it's really important for people to have an idea of what this is, because unless you do have that idea, you cannot begin to really appreciate the point really of this book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for a lot of us, if, you know, and it might not be this case for everybody. I mean, some people may come to Michael just more for music and the entertainer. But I think for some of us, and you'll know if this is you, if when you became a fan, it was kind of this huge impact and you were then drawn in and that was it, you know, and obviously now, even so many years after he's died, we're also still so passionate about him. I think that's where this spiritual thing is. You might not recognize it as that's what it is, but it is a connection. So for me personally, and Talitha even says at the beginning of her book, mine was went into the cinema to see Moonwalker, didn't really know heaps about Michael Jackson as a teenager. And I literally came out of that cinema a completely different person. And back then I couldn't put it into words and I couldn't necessarily understand it on what level it was. But the more you sort of go through, and I when I'm reading Lisa's book, that's certainly the sort of similar elements I got, you know, that kind of in my childhood with things going on and not necessarily connecting with people on that same level. I suddenly found this person who could speak to me on things. And she also mentions in there about connections with animals and about if you actually feel that with your heart. So if you see about animals sort of being produced as food, you won't do it. And that was certainly my experience. And I became vegetarian, and Michael was, you know, it all kind of seemed to feed in with that. And as I've sort of gone through life, then, you know, I've had counselling, and I was very lucky that the counsellor I had was a very spiritual person. And she sort of just made a lot more sense of everything for me. And I think that's where, if you've started to go, or you already have looked down that, that's where I found this a really easy book for me to read, because I kind of already had that background. But I can imagine, had I have read it maybe 10, 15 years ago, I might not have seen it quite as I do now. So it's about sort of really understanding that whether you are religious or not, and I'm not specifically to one religion, but I am very spiritual and believe in certainly the universe and that there's something more. And like Lisa mentioned, I'm very much, I've had my past lives done. I'm sort of, I do believe in all those things. That if you have that and you can understand that, the universe is something bigger and it's about energy and those kind of things. And you have that side of you. And if you go with that, and a lot of that is also things like your gut, if you believe in, go with your own intuition and your own gut, things lead you a certain way, and we can put obstacles in ourselves. So where she goes on later to talk about this second half of sort of Michael's life, it's more about where she's saying coming from ego. Now, that's not necessarily where people might straight away consider, oh, he's been an egomaniac. It's about where you're sort of, did he then lose some of that natural flow with going with the world? Now, I've got a slightly different take to little bits of Lisa on some of that in chapter 18, which I think we might discuss further. I've got some sort of angles where I think, other things sent him off on that different path. But it's about him as really, he was that, he would, and I think one of the things the book, again, you maybe already got to have sort of as an understanding of what an empath is, highly sensitive and these kind of things to really, really get it. So Michael absolutely was an empath. He was extremely on the high sensitive. So, those people that really have lived a number of lifetimes and they really, really understand how the universe works. And he was a real sort of tool for that. He then put into practice, talents that he was given, but obviously coupled those with hard work and really got this message out. And I think that's where, so many of us are absolutely touched by him, because actually, whether you realize it or not, it's hitting you at that level within your sort of yourself. And that's where I think within this, she's explaining that. And he is, because he's that highly sensitive, he's a very, very force of light. And unfortunately, and as we all see in his story, he's then attracts a lot of darkness because he is so light. But it's really about him as who he was as a soul, and that actually he was much more advanced in that than many people. And that comes from, whether you believe this or not, from having lived many past lives. And we always hear people refer to him, for the Motown area, he was an old soul in a child's body, and that's really it, because he's done this so many times. So he really had that huge connection, and that empath side of him made him connect incredibly with the world, children, animals, all those things, and really could sort of feel nature. And I think if you can get that background and have a look at, if you've never really heard of what is an empath as a person before looking into that, people who are highly sensitive, the light and the dark of the universe, and how you need both for the universe to exist and that kind of thing, you can maybe have a little bit more of an understanding of what Lisa's saying in here. It's certainly not a book that if you're coming from it or want to learn just about Judy's experiences with Michael Jackson one-on-one and what was said, it's not that. I think it's critical to kind of understand. But if you're wanting to explore from your own perspective, you've either gone down that journey already, or you know that you have this huge connection with Michael Jackson, you don't truly understand why, then it's a book that may sort of bring some of all those sort of pieces together. And, one of those elements that Emma's already mentioned is synchronicity. And that's another thing of the university. Universe is like where you're listening to signs and you're taking note of signs, but you're not looking for them as such. They come your way, but you take them in, you understand what they are, and you go with that and realize the flow of it. So I think that's kind of the basis of that part. I'll hand it back to you, Emma.
Yeah, thanks, Angie. I think that was a really great introduction. I think this book, for me personally, I didn't know too much about, I wouldn't say that I've really been a spiritual person. I think having read this book and having done extra research on this spiritual stuff, I do think that there's stuff that is within me naturally. And I know that we've spoken about this, that we do anyway, even, you know, having no knowledge of this stuff. And I think, again, you brought up the empathic trait. The more fans that I speak to, the more I feel that this is such a key connection that we have with Michael. And when you get kind of the fans that really understand him, it's because they are empaths. In order to understand Michael, you have to be an empath. And the reason why he understood us and he had such, you know, an amazing care and compassion for the world, the planet, children, animals, was because he was an empath. And so I think the theme of empathy is hugely important for, again, understanding this story. Now, I kind of half introduced, and Nicole, I'm going to come on to you for the next point. I introduced half of the kind of parallel stories, let's say. It's really important to mention, before I mention like the second half, let's say, of the story, it's important to note that Lisa, a really key point for the book is that Lisa strongly believed that Michael was put on this earth as a higher source. So, you know, like I said, the book opens up, he's Archangel Michael at the start of the book, and he's called to earth with the express purpose of showing this kind of light v darkness, and encouraging humans to reflect on their own consciousness and to choose for themselves whether they are going to live this life of light or whether they're going to live this light through darkness. And she's saying that it is a choice, but people don't know that it's a choice. They're not aware, they're not consciously aware of these kind of two paths, if you like. So his role, she believes, was to be put on earth to show us this is the amazing love, success, happiness that you can achieve if you follow what's in your gut, if you follow your spirit, if you connect with the world, if you know, are not driven by your ego. And like Angie said, ego is a really important word because it doesn't necessarily mean in this sense what some people might naturally think it means. So we're going to discuss that later. But what she's saying is after the first 25 years of his life, this is when things start to kind of take a bit of a downward spiral. And her argument is, and again, she believes it was orchestrated, this was part of his mission. He knew, well, that he was going to have to do this for his mission, but that his life then essentially descended into chaos, and it was with the sole purpose of making us reflect as humans on planet Earth, who are not always aware of our consciousness. It was to reflect on ourselves as a society and think, right, are we actually happy with the decisions that we're making? Are we happy with allowing our ego to take over and therefore having, you know, these kind of unhappy lifestyles, unhappy traits that she believes Michael sort of exemplified? Or would we rather, you know, have the life that he did for the first 25 years, which was, of course, you know, encouraged by nothing but contentment, happiness, you know, loving everybody, having compassion for everybody, like I said, being at one with the planet, being at one with other people, not having all these kind of divisive traits, I guess. Now, Nicole, I know I wasn't necessarily going to get into this early on, but how did you feel about that kind of argument? So this idea of spirit versus ego, and that Michael's first 25 years and the success that he achieved was because he followed his spirit, and then the essentially remainder of his life descending into unhappiness because he let go essentially of who he was and the essence of the spirit. How did you kind of interpret that argument?
When I first read that, when it was first presented, I suppose in that part of the book, I was a little bit sort of, I guess, curious. I was, okay, where's this going? I don't know if I fully understand where she was coming from. And then as chapter 18 continued, which is the chapter that focuses on that sort of fall from grace, or fall into darkness, as she calls it, I became very angry. I disagreed with so much of what was being presented. I saw things, I suppose, flaws I saw in what was being presented. I do know that the rest of the book provided a bit more context and explanation into chapter 18, but as chapter 18 was presented to me, I became quite I suppose angry, frustrated. It was the main feeling that I got from that particular chapter. And I think in part, I mean, upon my own reflection, I think in part I was perhaps viewing it from a different lens. You know, Lisa does go on to talk about the lenses that we view things from. That being said, even with that full understanding, there is still aspects of chapter 18 that I don't agree with. And there are things that, in terms of that timeline specifically, the 25 years, I don't know that fits perfectly well. There are things that were happening. If we were to take certain things that Lisa says that happened in the late 80s, some of those things we know were happening earlier on. So that doesn't fit with that analysis, if that makes sense. Particularly
Nicole,
yeah.
Sorry, just thinking to give people listening a bit of context. Do you want to go into, because are you talking about things, for example, that you know, where it's like, oh, really needs to beat Thriller, and that was already, you know, he already had that with Off the Wall. I don't know whether it's just worth giving a bit more context around that for people.
Well, that's exactly what I was referring to. I mean, that's the very first example that she gives, is that she was taken, and then that was one of the first things that she says opened her eyes to his behavior becoming more entrenched in ego. And I straight away went, well, that doesn't make any sense, because that was my first reaction. That doesn't make any sense, because to me, I want to make the best selling album of all time was a way bigger goal. That was a way more arrogant thing to aim for. In my mind, those two things didn't, you know, Thriller was probably even more so in terms of that being an arrogant type goal. Who are you to think you can sell the biggest selling album of all time? That would be what a lot of people, and that's what, you know, Quincy Jones and the others that were making Thriller with him, was their reaction to him at the time. So that didn't mesh with, in terms of what Lisa was presenting, if that makes sense. There's a few other things that I don't know if we want to go into all the details of the different things that I did or didn't agree with, but overall, I think what it comes down to is that that the analysis, I suppose, of how it's presented, I would love the opportunity to argue with Lisa about that. I'm sure she'd probably teach me a thing or two. I'm perfectly sure of that. At the same time, the overall, I do agree with this idea that he was able to show us the full experience of the human condition. I completely get that. I completely understand that we do see, obviously, a change, and we are able to see Michael from, I suppose, in two different lights, if that makes sense. That's the wrong word to use in this context, I know, but I couldn't think of a better one. And I do agree with that overall. And there's a lot of other, just that particular chapter certainly threw me. And I think it's worth mentioning to a lot of people who perhaps maybe even get to that section and are taken back the way that I was, that there is more to come that you do need to read, because for me, like I said, it was slightly antagonizing, and that might have been because of my lens that I was viewing it from. But when I got to chapter 6, I was like, oh, yes. So it does, sorry, not chapter 6, part 6, which is the later on sections. It does give that little bit more insight into what she's actually referring to.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on that chapter, because as I know we sort of, came at it sort of differently. I think everything of that is valid, and everyone, it's worth sort of knowing that you might have that reaction to it. And I agree with you. I mean, when I read that bit about sort of, oh, well, he's gone to ego because he now wants to be Thriller, I was the same. I was like, well, we already had that kind of visualization. He was always doing that visualization work about, putting the notes everywhere. And that's very much because, again, he really studied and was very aware of a lot of people around this, putting your message out into the universe and you get it back. And it's not necessarily about arrogance, but you've got to put that out there to get something back. And then you have to work towards it as well. And he studied a lot of people around that message. So I agree with you. I saw bits like that. I thought, no, that isn't the change that I saw. And then also she mentions in that, but she does put all kind of 3 scenarios, but around him getting on top of the vehicle at the trial and saying about that. Now, again, I think actually her third option is how I feel it was. So what she sort of basically is saying is about the ego, and, he's getting up there at the trial, and, she maybe didn't like that so much. And she offers kind of, I think it's 3 explanations. And my one I've always taken from it is that very much he was, he really took that energy back from fans, and it's this universe and the energy, and that going on that vehicle, he wasn't thinking about, the kind of average person sitting at home and what's their sort of, how do they view that? It was more that it was what he needed, and also what he felt the fans needed. It's that exchange. He was in the most critical time of his life, absolute pain, and they were sending out lots of love, and he needed to sort of go up there and take that in to keep him going. So I agree with you on that chapter. I think there's elements I disagree with. I understood the kind of whole entire message she's trying to get through, and I think the point that maybe was slightly missing, and that's where I can see where your reaction more, Nicole, when you read it, was really what actually I feel it is, rather than he was moving to ego, it's actually the fact that he was really, really bombarded with a lot of darkness. And what actually I feel happened was his attention went to, and how could it not almost, his attention went to that. How could he almost protect himself by the amount he was bombarded? And the kind of bit lacking from that is that, there were forces at work. And I'll just briefly mention the name of it anymore, David Geffen and others, that he's got that kind of force against him. He's got all these accusations. He's got, negative forces in the industry, everything coming at him. Then, of course, the one that we know, everybody knows, is the tabloids. So you're being hit constantly with that. And I think what happened was it's more of a transition of how can one man then still continue to fight back with light when you're hit that hard. And I think that's maybe where that chapter sort of maybe doesn't explain it as well. And like you say, you go on and you can sort of pull that back. But I think it's not really, in my eyes, and again, this is just my opinion, so who's to say that I'm right over Lisa, but it isn't so much a moving to ego. It is in ego in as much of his awareness of the darkness. And she mentions things like putting out songs like Scream, and he's like, it's this arguing back. But again, well, why wouldn't he be arguing back? You're getting hit this hard. And yes, of course, for him personally, if he'd have just gone, right, just keep sending out my light, maybe he wouldn't have absorbed as much. But how can you have to be truly superhuman to have not let any of that ever get to you. And she does sort of bring in the elements of sort of painkillers and that. And yes, there is an element of when you start having to take things like that, you are numbing things and you're numbing emotions and maybe your natural gut and your spirit. And one of the things I sort of highlighted and wrote was that it was more his not able to keep his vibration quite as high then when things started to sort of go down. And I think it's that part that needed maybe a little bit more explanation to a reader, because it's like any of us, and I've done this myself, 2019 with that thing we won't mention, I went onto Twitter and I'm out there defending, and you're getting so much darkness hit you back. It took me down a bad path and I had to step back. And that's like with Michael, if you're forced with that much negativity at you, it's very hard to stay super light, no matter who you are and what you are like. And I think that's more the transition. It's that recognition of how much he was being hit. Back in the days, he was always having an element of that, and even as a kid, but it went to another crazy level almost in every angle in his life. The tabloids, in the entertainment industry, allegations, other people who very very powerful turning on him. And what I took from it as well was and she doesn't say this, but sort of my thoughts went down the line of, I completely agree with him hanging on to that ATV catalogue, and I can understand why he did it. It was his, and why should he? But in a way, if he'd maybe given that up, would he have found himself not such a subject of getting so much darkness, and maybe could have been around for more years? But again, why should he have to? But there's an element of, maybe if you go to the spiritual thing and the light, you sort of go, do you know what? It's not worth hanging on to this thing that's very, very dark. There's too many dark forces wanting that catalogue. And that's how I feel the transition was. And I think that's where that chapter 18 doesn't maybe really get that message through as much. I don't know what you think of what I've just said, whether you think the same or not.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you were saying, particularly about the darkness coming at him as opposed to him. And maybe that comes down to our slightly different beliefs to the way that Lisa views it, or our different understanding of the spiritual sort of aspects that she's talking about. But certainly my view is a lot more in line with yours, particularly with reference to some of those things. I know you listed them off, but like the other one that probably annoyed me a lot was the black or white video. You can imagine my reaction to that one. But I mean, we obviously could dissect that particular chapter for a long time. That being said, I do think that what came after that chapter was more to learn from, if that makes sense. I can't think of the word. The most important part of the book for me was part 6, which I can't remember the chapter numbers, I'm sorry, but part 6 certainly it almost is an elaboration of chapter 18, and it's certainly, there's not that same level of reaction from me. I didn't have that same reaction. Part 6 I actually quite loved, and it gives that bit more context that perhaps isn't given in chapter 18, which is one of the reasons why. So
from chapter 22 onwards is part
22
6.
onwards, yeah. Part 6 is I think the most important part of the book. I know Betty Lou commented before that she actually stopped reading, I think she said, at chapter 22. So Betty Lou, you might find I commented back before to her about finding the rest of the book particularly important after I got to that section. So perhaps Betty Lou might be inspired to read the rest of it, because certainly part 6 for me was probably my favourite section of the book.
There's so much positivity from the book. I think that's really important. I think if you haven't read the book, you're kind of listening to some of the stuff that's been mentioned, and you haven't heard anything else, and you haven't read anything else, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this is a negative book, and it's not. This is someone who loves Michael. She feels that she has a real connection with him. She loves him. She believes that this was all orchestrated. She believes that he was here for this reason. It's not it's not an attack on Michael. It's not like a criticism, and it's not about that. And there's, like I said, there's so many positive things that were spoken about, which we are going to speak about for the rest of the session. But this idea of ego is really important to bring up, because it is a huge part of her narrative and what she believes was Michael's mission. And like we keep reiterating, you can't understand the reflections, which are much more relatable, much more believable, unless you have got through chapter 18. They kind of, you can't understand one without the other. So it's really important to particularly highlight that chapter, although it is quite a difficult chapter to read, and you don't have to agree with everything. But like I said, you can't really understand the rest of the book without reading that. I do just want to, before we go on to all the positive things that were mentioned, and there's some amazing anecdotes, thoughts, views on, you know, Neverland and children, that's, you know, and the planet Earth, which is really, really relevant again to Lisa's story and, you know, to Michael in general. But just going back to the ego, because I think, you know, there's some people saying that they haven't read the book, and I don't know if they're taking this ego thing in the wrong way. We think of ego as being like egotistical, as Angie said, meaning like you're selfish, or, you know, you only think of yourself. That's not really the angle that she was coming from. If you look at ego from a spiritual perspective, it's this idea that you are detaching yourself from the spirit world, that, you know, if you come from a spiritual place, then you believe that you are at one with the universe. So you are not separated from this chair, you are not separated from a tree, you're not separated from the person next to you. You know, you're all part of the same kind of chemical makeup energy in the world. And as soon as you start to detach yourself from that, you then find your ego. And when we start acting from our ego rather from our spirit and from this oneness with the world, then she believes that's when things start to go wrong for us. So when she was discussing focusing on the numbers for bad and chasing that success for bad, and I want to outdo Thriller and that kind of stuff, she said that it made her think of Deepak Chopra's 7 spiritual laws of success, which is that you should set the intention. So you should say, okay, well, this is what I want to achieve, but you have to detach yourself from the outcome. So, for example, don't focus on numbers, don't focus on money. You know, you say, right, I want to be really successful, or I want to, you know, achieve this kind of stardom or whatever. But as soon as you start being greedy for numbers or money, or I want to earn this and I want to, you know, that becomes the ego. And so therefore things are not going to kind of work in your favor. And that's basically a summary really of what she means by the ego. It's not about being selfish and not caring about people. It's about forgetting your purpose in this world, which is to love, to share love, to Angie, can you explain it a bit better?
No, I think you're doing a brilliant job. You get too much in your own head, so you're really thinking things rather than going with a flow. So a bit like when Lisa's sort of mentioning throughout hers about, you know, going with that flow in life and the synchronicities she's seeing on the way. If you're sort of going with the flow, you're much more in tune with the universe. The minute you start really going, I'm going to take this, and it's a fine balance, because there's a lot of that visualization that's really connected with the universe as well. So it's kind of in between thing. But if you go too far the other way, so if you become like, well, I've got to fight back against everybody because they think that, you're going too much in your sort of thinking mind and strategy, rather than, well, I know this is the case, and if I keep on this path, it will all come good, kind of thing. If I follow my path, everything will work out the way it's supposed to be. When you start to fight against things, you're going a bit more into your ego. And as you say, it's very much not you're being selfish. It's just that kind of, you've lost that connection with what is natural and kind of innate. And this is one of the main key things of meditation. It's about that connection back to the universe and listening to the flow of the world, rather than, you know, sort of acting out like this is exactly what I'm going to achieve. So yeah, that's what she's trying to describe in that chapter. It's that sort of shift of not as connected naturally with letting, you know, the universe and the light kind of run through you and achieve. And you know, the thing is, she notes in it herself doing those things herself, and we all do it. I know when I've moved more into that element in my sort of, you know, when I've spoke to the lady I sort of mentioned who did about spiritual, she'll say, right, hang on, take it back, go and do something creative. And that's where creativity is really on that line of it. When you move too far away from the creative, that's when you're going too much in kind of to ego. It doesn't mean we all necessarily have to be natural at art or singing or anything, but doing something that's not so logical and you're just going with the free flow of it all.
Yeah, exactly. I knew that you would explain it better than me. Part of what she says in terms of the ego is about the importance of, in order to still remain connected to the God, because, you know, I don't feel you have to be religious, as you said, Angie, to have a connection with the spiritual world, but for her, she is religious and she believes in God. Interestingly, we've had discussions on previous JIGS sessions about Michael's relationship with religion. Obviously, we know his history with the Jehovah's Witness, and we kind of did start to ponder whether once he started to get into the spiritual way of thinking, whether he still saw God as this person, as he was brought up to believe, or whether actually he just believed in God being this higher power, this kind of higher source. Obviously, Lisa's argument is that not that he is God, but that he is part of this higher source and that he was sent with this particular mission. But one of the things that was quite difficult to read is that Lisa believes that it's really important to take responsibility for your own self, your own actions, and that the more you don't take responsibility, the more you in turn victimize yourself, which the ego loves, and therefore you kind of continue onto that descent. And I think that's really hard to read when you think about Michael and all that he went through. It's hard to read from the perspective of essentially blaming him for his downfall, and he created this for himself. But again, I don't necessarily think that that's what she's saying. But what she's saying is that if you go back to, for example, the songs, you know, there is a huge shift in his songs up until, let's say, maybe bad, maybe to some extent dangerous, but particularly from history onwards, you know, the narrative of his music completely changed. And you did sense that it went from just creating for the love of music and you know, just letting it be like a completely natural process, to almost him forcing the creative process that he kind of was so against in a way. He always said you have to create from what you feel and not what you think. But because of what he'd been through, I know Nicole's going to completely disagree with this, and I'm not saying I agree. I'm just saying this is what she's saying. That, you know, he became, even in his songs, he kind of victimized himself. It was kind of like, poor me, you know. And she actually, one of the things that she did say is that he spent a lot of his time, especially after the allegations, trying to make the world love him. And that comes from an ego place. You don't see yourself as being at one with the world anymore, and therefore that's going to accentuate, you know, the negativity that
just, you know, on that I think what my reading was of that was more that she was saying that he clearly had this kind of hole that still needs to be filled from childhood. And I think I highlighted it. There was one sentence where she said about basically, why didn't he get counselling? Well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, if he could have got an amazing counsellor, it would have helped him with that. However, how do you, as Michael Jackson, feel you can trust anybody to go to those deep levels of what counselling has to take you to? So I think that's probably clear why, you know, he didn't necessarily end up down that path. But I think the victim bit, I read it more as it's about, again, if you, a bit like when I was saying, when I went into Twitter after the thing and you fall down that darkness, it's more about not being a victim, but the more you see the world through a negative lens, the more you get, kind of thing. It's not necessarily seeing yourself as, oh, poor me as a victim. It's just more that. So the more that you concentrate on that aspect, the more darkness that you attract. So, you know, if your music is more about hitting back out, it's going to come back at you, rather than you're sending out a message of light, you should get light back. I think it's that, rather than, you know, a victim in the victim sense. It's that your focus is going towards the dark that's being thrown at you and trying to push back at that, rather than just naturally doing it, which, again, I mean, the guy was hit every angle that he could be, and how you get through any of that, I just don't think it's almost possible that you could go. I mean, certainly on small levels myself, when I've gone through things, it's like, right, okay, I need to just go, know that this is going to be okay, everything's going to turn out all right. And if I pick myself up, and the higher vibration you are, the better I'll be. But I'm not hit with the things that he was hit with. And I just think, I don't know if you're accused of those kind of things and you feel that the media and you feel that a lot of the world believes it, how do you ever then go, oh, great, I'm on a really high vibration? I think that's almost an impossible thing to expect of anyone going through that much. But I think what she's trying to also show you is the similar, and I'm not religious. She does mention looking at a lot of religions. I look at all of them and I don't take any single one. I take it all that they're a kind of a smaller thing of around the universe. It's kind of people trying to explain what the universe is. But I think with that angle, it's basically, you know, I've kind of lost my train of thought, sorry. But basically said on that sort of religious side, it's more about him as that sort of tool for it, and then he's been hit with all this human, and it's almost a reflection of what Jesus went through. So it's not necessarily saying, and like I say, I don't necessarily go, oh, I'm Christian or anything, but what she's trying to say is, you know, he came with a message, Michael came with a message, then you get to see that message from another angle when you get hit with the dark, you know, Jesus obviously the crucifixion, and Michael with that kind of crucifixion, and ended both with death. It's kind of that movement into that, and it's almost predestined by the fact that you're there as a kind of prophet to show a message, and sadly it's the way it's going to go. And the amount he got hit with, I just don't see how you could ever truly lift yourself above that without fighting back. Don't know if that makes any sense.
Super quick thing I was going to add. I think I actually believe a lot of what she says, but I think that as a theory it makes sense. But when you start to add human emotions and human reactions, and like, you know, if we were just robots, then I think that like this, all of this stuff that she's saying, I think that probably is sort of how the world works. But you know, we are humans, we are on planet Earth, we do only have a certain, well, even if we have a high level of consciousness in terms of we can be aware of the, you know, even Lisa said, as you said, she's really aware of all of this, and even she falls into the traps. Like, you're going to do that if you know, I say traps, you know what I mean. You know, we all get angry, we all feel a need to stick up for ourselves, we all feel hurt when people perceive us in a certain way, and obviously Michael was the extreme example of someone who is perceived in a completely different way than he should have been perceived. And, you know, for anyone to think that that's not going to completely damage you. And I think actually a lot of what he did was, put it this way, I think other people would have done a lot worse. I think he showed great strength in how he dealt with a lot of throne. Again, I do believe, from a theoretical point of view, I actually do believe in what she talks about. And I do think that when we do, for example, worry about what others think of us, we do that does detach us from what we are meant to be doing, seeing, focusing on, etc. But as I said, when you start to include human emotions into that, it's really difficult to, you know, to not show that human nature, I guess.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. That's what I'm kind of saying. You're right. It's everything about this is right, and I completely follow this. But you know, we all know in our own lives on a much smaller scale, we get hit by little things that take us off down, you know, a sad path, an angry path, or whatever. And if we could all just go, oh yeah, you know what, just let it wash over, then yes, we would find it probably gets better quicker, because the more negative you sort of feel, the more negative things you'll see and that will happen to you. But as you've correctly explained then, I was trying to say before about you'd have to be superhuman, which I think he was anyway, to how could you not be affected by all that? It's basically an impossibility to have not been affected by the amount that he had thrown at him. You know, the pain that he was, you know, caused, and the amount of sort of hate and negativity and all of that he had directed towards him. You know, you are going to end up taking some of that on board and reflecting it back by things like songs on history. You know, he didn't get to have a voice, he was silenced. So, you know, it's hard to just go, oh, that's fine, I'll just carry on and I'll put out all my, you know, really happy songs and everyone will just see it themselves. We all get where we will defend ourselves and feel defensive in moments, and trying to, yes, in theory, it'd be all great if none of us did, but we are going to. It's very hard, and it's about reminding yourself all the time to try not to go down that avenue and get pulled into that sort of negativity and darkness.
I think as well, he was sort of damned if he does, damned if he doesn't, because, you know, for a long time, he was very private about his life, and he didn't fall into that trap of fighting back and speaking out. But then he was criticised for that. And one of the things that I see all the time written in books, even by, you know, a pro Michael, and I think it's a fair argument to some extent, but it's like, well, why didn't he speak out more? Why didn't he speak out more about his appearance? Why was he so private? Why didn't he be more honest about his lupus? Why didn't he be more honest about the vitiligo? People might have understood him better if he'd have spoken about those things. But then, like, in this discussion, we're kind of saying, well, actually, if you know, if we think about it from this spiritual sense, well, if you do that, if you do speak out and you do act defensively and you do care about what people think, then you're going to kind of attract more of the negativity, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like, I feel like he did actually fight that off for a long time, but obviously things got to a point where you can't, as a human being, you cannot just sit there and be attacked to the severity that he was without, you know, at least trying to kind of have your
this is kind of what this book is trying to say to you as well. That should be a reflection on the people that think that. So those people who, you know, if we take the sleeping in bed with children kind of, and she mentioned on that, people who think it's that way, well, that's where you're coming from, and it's your anger. It's this word, she says, a reflection of our collective soul, but also a reflection on you. And like with his vitiligo, why should, you know, what, I'm sure some people wanted him to almost just show you all the areas he had. But again, that says more about you. If you can't take a man's word for it, or you can't already see that, I mean, really, do you seriously think he's just trying to turn himself into a white man? Don't be so ridiculous. Of course there's something there. think more broadly, have more empathy. So it's more of a reflection on those people that can't do that. And I think that's what she's trying to say here. He is almost a reflection of you, how you know, who you are and how you see it. If you're always looking through a sort of suspicious or a negative lens, then you'll see what you want to see in him. You'll see that you think he did this or that, or you'll see that you think he turned himself white because he hated blacks. Completely crazy and ridiculous, but people will see it through their lens, and it's that reflection. I mean, one thing the lady mentioned who sort of helped me with stuff, she always says to me, it's about putting a mirror up to people, and that's exactly what Lisa's trying to say. Michael did, it's putting a mirror up to them, and you see how your your sort of own reflection of how you see the world. And that's where we know how polarizing Michael is and the haters, but that says an awful lot about who they are, that they can't okay, if you don't really like him, you don't need to say all the things you say and go out on this mission. But that says everything about who you are and where you're coming from, and that you're probably more on the dark than you are on the light side, and you're certainly suffering from a lack of empathy and those kind of things.
Nicole, how did you feel? Obviously, Neverland and Michael's relationship with children was a huge part of the book, and was something that I mean, obviously there's like a whole section and at least one chapter, if not more, that's dedicated to that, but it was something that kind of appeared throughout the book. And obviously we know that Judy worked there, and interestingly, she was let go from there, I believe it was 1996, if I'm not mistaken. That is from memory, so I apologize if that's wrong, but interestingly, she was actually let go from there when Michael built up such a relationship with her that he actually started to trust her with his cousins. So when his cousins would come to visit, he would allow her to spend time with them and play with them and stuff like that. And she felt that the powers that be, and I mean physical beings, but people in authority, she very much got a sense that they wanted to rid Michael of people who he was getting too close to. So anyone that they felt he was building up a relationship with, they kind of got rid of them. So she was let go from Neverland in 96. But Nicole, how did you feel that sort of Neverland and children were portrayed in the book, and kind of what was the importance of those in the story in Michael's life?
How it's portrayed in the book, I mean, I think she does a really good job of explaining what Neverland was, and what it meant to Michael, and what it meant to all those people that were lucky enough to have the chance to be there and to experience it. She gives a very good, like a sort of an insight into what Family Day would have been like and all of those kinds of things. So all those people that were lucky enough to experience it would obviously understand where she was coming from in that regard. But then the way that it's explained, that how obviously, as Angie was just saying with that mirror, that what others see is a reflection of themselves rather than what it was really like. Because when you do speak to or hear things directly from those who were there and who got to experience it, you only ever hear stories of that, of the magic and the fun and the laughter and the healing and all of those kinds of stories. And the interpretation that it was something other than that says more about those people that are saying it than it does about what Neverland was really like. And I think that that's presented really well in Lisa's book.
You're on mute, Emma.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things that really links to what you said that really kind of shot out for me in the book is, one of the things that I hear from a lot of non-fans about Neverland is, well, you know, why would a man create like a theme park for his house? Like, what grown man would do that? You know, it has to be for agenda A, B, C. And actually, I think this was Judy who said this in the book, but it might have been Lisa, I can't remember which one, but the quote is, as Michael once said, there are grown-ups who come to Neverland and they say to me, you know, I haven't done the thing I've done here in years. You can let your guard down and be a child again. And I say, that's what Neverland's for, to return to your innocence, to have fun. It really made me think. And I'm like, well, actually, I think all of us, we have all done things in our adult years that are very childish. We enjoy water fights. If there's a bouncy castle, how many of us go on a bouncy castle? You know, how many of us go to theme parks and love the energy and the thrill of a roller coaster? And so when you actually start, you know, and this is what you were saying about holding that mirror up, people don't want to admit that because it doesn't feed into this narrative that he was an abuser. If we actually think, oh, actually, I would have really loved going to Neverland, like what a really cool place. If I had all that money, I would probably build something the same. You know, people seem to think that if they kind of admit that, like, and they have this narrative about Michael being an abuser, well, does that make me an abuser? You know, do you understand what I'm trying to say? People are not honest with themselves. If they were honest with themselves, they'd realize, well, actually, this was a like super cool place that if anyone went to visit, whether you're 8, 18 or 80, you'd have the best day because it has loads of stuff that we all loved as children, and all of us are now nostalgic beings. We all love to reminisce on our childhood, and we all like to try and recreate parts of our childhood, even in adulthood. And that's why having children is so enjoyable, because they, and again, Lisa touches upon this, they kind of really portray that kind of that fun element, that spontaneity, that innocence. They're just pure. They make us laugh because, you know, they've got no filter. They just say what they think, and all of this stuff we almost kind of chase after, I think, as in our adulthood to some extent. Or if we don't chase after it, we at least enjoy it when we have the opportunity, you know, to enjoy it. But I think, you know, again, it's this reflection on society. Well, I'm not even going to think about it from that perspective because it doesn't fit my narrative that I want to believe that he was an abuser. And if I change that narrative on how I feel about Neverland, if I actually admit to myself that I would really have liked to have gone there, that it would have been a really cool day out for me and my family, or, you know, what an amazing thing it would have been for all of these sick or underprivileged children who went there, for example, then that's not going to fit the narrative that I want to believe. And so I think things like that are so important to changing people's perspective. But, you know, to some extent, this is where I feel I don't know if we can always change people's perspective. If people are going to stick to that narrative the media have done for forever, people don't want to see, and again, it comes down to empathy, doesn't it? People don't want to be empathic because it means letting go of what you want your narrative to be. And if you want your narrative to be that Michael's an abuser, then you're not going to look at any part of his life any differently, because that's not going to fit that narrative.
Yeah, and you can find some, but you won't all. So the people that are sort of what we'd class as haters, you're never ever going to change their mind, because it's not just about Michael Jackson. That's about who they are. It's the people who are open, but they've only ever had a view from what the tabloids feed them. So they're the ones that you can, you know, once you introduce them to that, they can see it. And I think that's the thing where you were saying with Neverland as well. It's all of those things you've said, plus it's that putting yourself, even though it's almost an impossible thing to do, in his shoes. He didn't do any of this as a child, and then he still can't do it as an adult because he is hounded by fans, the press, and just general public who want to look at him as like, oh my God, here's this superstar. So he can't even do that outside of the gates, really. Anyway, so he can't even go and recreate that in the world as everybody else is comfortable. Everybody else is comfortable with us having theme parks, but just not with Michael Jackson having one. But they can't see that he can't do that anyway. And then that additional element of he, again, being the amazing sort of empath that he was, and that give. He didn't just create it for himself. He created it for others, and particularly children who, you know, are from backgrounds that don't get those opportunities, and, you know, sick children, that magic can just help either heal them for that moment, long term or whatever, or just offer them some joy away from their sort of negative situation. And when I had my day in Neverland in 1999, I was really lucky. I didn't know it was going to happen, but I was actually there on one of the days that Big Al talks about, where they basically coached in about 250 kids from LA, from like a ghetto. They'd never had holidays. They'd never done things like theme parks. And when you can actually be around that and just hear and feel that excitement. Michael wasn't around that day. So, you know, he's, you know, and people have a narrative that it's all kind of some disgusting thing, which I don't really want to go into. He wasn't even there half the time, but he's giving anyway. He doesn't have to be there to sort of give. He wants to just truly give. And that, seeing actually the magic of that in person, I mean, feeling the magic of Neverland anyway, and all that, I completely understand why he went to live in that area. If you visit Los Olivos and Solvang, I mean, they truly are quite magical places, really, really quaint, and they're like a little bit of a step back in time, although not always that step backs in times are positive things, but that kind of quaint, sort of more innocent, it has a beautiful vibe about it as a place anyway. And then you add Michael's energy in, and then you add in like those children visiting on that day, and it's just incredible. And it's about people getting to really understand that that's actually what it's about. But yeah, you won't win over those that are too far that side, but the people in the middle are the ones that really, you know, I think we're all trying to sort of reach out to when we're all doing stuff around Michael's legacy and getting him to be understood. And I think that long after we're all dead, if there could be the right things remaining for his legacy, people will pick up on it as the way it should be, because there won't be those tabloids still selling the same stories. They can go and actually see his music, see his videos, learn about his humanitarian efforts, and they truly see him for actually what he was, without the filter of the negative of things like media. You're on mute again, Emma.
Sorry, I just want to say, you can't add anything to what we've just discussed so far.
I had a few points along the way, but I think you've both said them. So,
are we?
You know, you hear an idea,
well,
and then you go, "Oh no."
Oh, so, well, at least the guys know this is not scripted. So, one thing I wanted to just finish on with the topic of children before we go on to the importance of talking about planet Earth, which again is a big feature in the book, and then we kind of go into the final reflections, which is really the crux of the whole book. So important to spread kind of that message, which, like we keep saying, fully explains the narrative and the theory behind what Lisa has been saying. But, you know, I think again this book really explains the importance of children from a different perspective yet again. So the topic of children, I find, comes up quite a lot in these JIGS sessions, because it's always something that's mentioned in whichever book we study, because obviously it was such a prevalent part of Michael's life. But you know, when we're talking about living in spirit and just being at one with the world and not having this ego and having certain emotions that, you know, lead to the kind of ego taking over, Lisa and Michael, and again I include Michael in this because Michael's been quoted on a few occasions pretty much saying these words, but part of the reason that he was so connected to children is because Lisa writes that as children we come into this life in spirit closely connected to God. however you want to think of God to be. Yet as we grow into adolescence and eventually adulthood, we are often deterred from this place of purity and innocence, this natural level of creation. And I know that one of the things that a lot of parents, I'm a teacher, and a lot of parents, both from my children at school's perspective and parents in terms of people that I know who have children, when you have discussions about the curriculum, particularly in this country, but I would say probably in a lot of countries in the world, it's very much deterring children. And I know this is going off on a tangent a little bit, but I do think it's relevant. It's almost deterring children from retaining that level of creativity. We are not encouraging people to think for themselves. We're encouraging people to think, to be taught A, B, and C with the explicit goal of getting them to believe and do A, B, and C, right? So we don't encourage, from childhood into adulthood, we don't really encourage people to think for themselves. And that's why a lot of people believe that we do actually have this really strong intuition, but that as we grow into adulthood, we tend to lose it because we're not told to follow our heart, we're told to think with our head, right? So she says that, you know, children have this natural level of creation before it's taken away from them. This is, they are at one with the world. They find, you know, we've seen so many people talk about Michael just finding magic in everything, like a leaf falling from a tree. He would just, you know, and that's what children are like. Children find magic in just the littlest of things. They don't think about things, they don't complicate things, they just take the world as it is. And Michael's actually quoted in the Martin Bashir interview as saying that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, we must embrace the innocence of the child. And when you sort of read this book, you do wonder if him being around children was sort of, in a way, his attempt to keep a hold of that natural creativity, obviously that was so important to his life as a superstar, but obviously he so believed in this spiritual journey. And by being around adults, what adults do is they encourage you to let go of that kind of spiritual way of thinking, or feeling, I should say, because you're not meant to think, you're meant to feel. By the time most adults get to adulthood, they have let go of that natural creativity, that oneness with the world. Whereas if you mix with children, they will actually allow you to continue with that thought process. And part of the reason that Michael was so attacked is because he didn't want to have those narrow thought processes that adults have. He didn't want to have the negative traits that so many adults have. He didn't want to share that. He didn't want to be around people that were going to suppress him and suppress his views and suppress his beliefs. Whereas, you know, I feel like children would just encourage him and allow him to, you know, to kind of follow that journey, I guess. How do you guys feel about that?
You can't enjoy something. That is absolutely agree with that, and I think it's you know, as well. I mean, I know it's always quoted that he also loved old people, and if you think about the older you are, you're reaching that way. Reaching that way as well. And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely that, because, you know, as children aren't born racist or anything like that. It is the adults and the process that squashes things out of people, and, you know, squashes sort of spirituality. It's why you get so many more children that see spirits or that can tell you about their past lives, because they're still quite connected to everything. And it's only once things start to influence them that then that kind of changes. And, you know, he had so many adults around him that wanted something. They had an agenda. Very hard for him to know who you can truly trust, because how people behave to his face, and, you know, even just his fans, sort of, when you see things, people, how they behave to his face, versus when he's not around. They're two different things, and they always want something. I mean, even, I think I've said it before, I mean, personally, when I was at that Oxford speech and saw Shmuley, he gave me very bad vibes just being in his presence. You know, and I think that then that sort of later kind of comes to light when you can see the way he is now. But, you know, at least with children or animals, that they just want love, and they just want to, you know, be in that. And he always said it was about the love, and that is, you know, all of that. So I think it makes complete sense. And as you say, with the creativity, and I said to you, as in the lady that helps me, she always says, you know, if you're going too far that, you need to go do something creative. It's about pulling yourself sort of back out of the very sort of logical and you know, the way of the world. And staying away from things. I mean, this is where I think, you know, as Michael fans, we should be more aware of this, but I see Michael fans who get caught up into it, where, you know, the media will portray one political party as the devil and one as the angel. And they're not. The party's made of lots of people with different opinions and agendas and approaches. But you'll see Michael fans will be like, really on a thing about politics. And I think you should be able to step back and see a bigger picture. And, you know, there's narratives being made by media all the time on these things. And it's all through the media's lens. You've got to step back and sort of, you know, see those things and, you know, be like children where everything isn't quite so black and white. They, like you say, it's that seeing with wonderment and just recognizing, you know, good in so many things.
I think just one more thing on the children topic. I mean, one thing I really like about chapter 6 is the way that it kind of deals with how Michael's life highlights, like if we are to look at his life, it highlights flaws in society in general. And so obviously it goes through image and things like addictions, and then even goes to the medical profession and all these different areas, these flaws in society in general. And I think, Emma, what you said about children, it almost, not that it could be another section within there, if you know what I'm saying. You've kind of alluded to that in what you said just before, that if you look at the way that he was with children, you can kind of see the flaws in society in the way that we often treat children, depending on the culture. Obviously, there's different cultures throughout the world. But I know, you know, myself, when I had my kids, I was, and perhaps it comes down to that, what happened first, the chicken or the egg? Was I drawn to Michael because of the beliefs I already had, or was there already a connection there, or did I get influenced by him? I don't know what came first, but as a mum, I had this sort of natural way that felt the right way to me, but society was kind of bombarding you with, you know, you should be doing this, no, you should be doing that, you should be doing this. And when you look at the way that he was with children, I think it highlights some of the flaws in what we do with children in education and in other areas as well.
And just on that point, you made me think of another bit, because Lisa talks about, and she said she feels uncomfortable sort of writing about it, the bit where she goes to hug someone who needed it. And on the physical, on the outside, maybe they aren't as society should be. And she realised for a moment what she was doing. And I think, again, you can see where Michael didn't have that. And we know this of the things, you know, where, you know, he's approaching, I think it's the child in South Africa who, you know, all the doctors aren't even going near. And he has no fear of that whatsoever. And that tells you an awful lot about him. And, you know, he wasn't, that's definitely in no way an ego or thinking of yourself in a selfish capacity either. It's just there. And it's that reaching out. He knew that child needed to know that they were validated and special and loved. And he went straight in and did that. And that was the most important thing. Not, you know, oh God, could I get something? You know, have I got to be fearful? Oh, if I'm ill, I won't be able to, you know, go out and make my record or anything. That would, no thinking. It was purely feeling and from the heart. And that's where, you know, he And again, I mean, even though sort of Lisa's book does talk about this turnaround from sort of 25 years onwards, again, 2001 was the Oxford speech. You've only got to read that speech to really see his true message and what he's trying to get out there in the world, and also his huge understanding of, actually, if you look at the issues in the world, most of them come back to childhood. So if you can just fix so much of that, then you fix so many problems in the world, because actually, you know, adults that are maybe acting out or doing this, that, the other, it comes from hurt and pain and issues that they haven't dealt with in their childhood. So I think it's really sort of, it's key part of him and his message.
Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that was, again, a huge focal point for the book, I guess, again, as an extension of what we've been discussing anyway, was Planet Earth and Michael's connection to Planet Earth and his message for looking after Planet Earth. So, you know, again, from this spiritual journey perspective, we are at one with the world, which means we are at one with the planet. And Lisa believes that when people do not look after, for example, the planet or each other, it's because they are not, you know, what we've been talking about, spirit versus ego. Their spirit, they're not following their spirit. They're not at one with these people, with these, with nature, and therefore it becomes much easier to abuse it. Basically, if you don't feel a connection to somebody or to something, it's much easier to not look after it, right? And you know, again, I think Michael really, this was something that Michael truly believed as well, which is why he constantly talks about, when he talks about healing the world and saying that the children are the ones that we need to focus on, it's because, you know, they are the ones who have this connection, this, you know, they're allowing themselves to be at one with the world, and therefore if we can nurture them in the right way to continue with that thought process, then they will actually look after the planet. They won't make the same mistakes that we do, being in a different kind of consciousness, I guess. Now, what was really interesting about the chapter that really discusses Planet Earth is that Lisa wrote this in Hawaii, and she really felt that Michael guided her to Hawaii, to a particular place to write this book. And Nicole, I don't know if you have the story in front of you or some notes in front of you on her experience with the whales. If you do, would you mind sharing that? And if not, I can do that, because that was a really beautiful story, and I think it would be one that's worth sharing.
Yeah, I loved that story as well. Just for those that haven't read it, I suppose, as Emma said, Lisa felt sort of drawn to Hawaii, and while she was there, she had a few different experiences of feeling connected to the earth. But on one particular day, she went whale watching, and obviously got to see some magnificent things. But the striking thing in the story is the fact that everything that happened was so amazing that even the actual what's the word? The tour operators, I suppose, if that's the best description of them, that they were sort of enjoying everything as much as everybody else was, because they were seeing things that they'd never seen before, and telling them how, oh, that never happens. We never see this. We don't see that. So they were basically seeing whales breaching and splashing back into the water. The whales were coming right up to the boat. But it obviously it sounded like a spectacular type of experience, and just one of the many stories of where you sort of stop and each of them on their own, all those little synchronicities that happen throughout her life, you might go, oh, you know, that's nothing type of thing. But when you add all of the tiny little ones up all the way along, and the fact that she only sort of decided at the beginning of the month to go to Hawaii and was there within the month, it just all sort of happens for a reason, I suppose, is the best way to put it. But it was certainly a lovely part of the book to hear that whale story.
And I really loved the part they kind of saw that initial whale show and they thought, okay, that was it, because obviously the purpose for this boat trip was to, you know, go and see some whales. But then she said there were 4 huge whales that came and actually escorted the boat for about 10 minutes, and they just put on this unbelievable show. And the tour guides had never seen anything like it. I was like, you know, I think the quote was, "This is the tour of the century," or something, or the show of the century. And what was really lovely about that particular story is Lisa then says she went back. I'm not sure if she was still in Hawaii or whether she'd gone back home, but she felt the need to go back to the book Dancing the Dream. She felt like there was going to be something in there, or she felt like she'd read something in there before that was going to relate to what she just experienced. And she said that when she came to the reflection called Magic, he wrote in there, the whole world abounds in magic. When a whale plunges out of the sea like a newborn mountain, you gasp in unexpected delight. What magic? And then I'm continuing with the quote. I'm missing a bit in between. But when we open our hearts and appreciate all she has given us, nature finds her reward and she bows. And she really felt that the whales had come to her because they knew what her plans were and what Michael's plan was through her. And she really felt that the whales had come to say thank you, like thank you for paying attention to us, and thank you for fighting for us, and thank you for getting this message out, and for kind of looking after us. And of course then she rehears the lyric in her song, "What about crying whales?" And again it just all kind of, she really just felt that everything was connected to this experience. So I thought that was just such an amazing story. Okay, so let's go on to kind of the final reflection. So we've said in a few times in this discussion that part 6 was really important, and for a lot of us that found previous chapters particularly difficult, we felt that part 6 is kind of where it all came together, and where we were managed to, even if we still disagreed with certain things that had been said, we just felt that this was the section of the book where you know, things kind of made sense and came together, and you could kind of see the purpose of her book and what she was trying to achieve, I guess. So Nicole, do you want to kick us off with this one? What kind of reflections did you take, or what did you feel that her message was, or that you took from part 6?
Well, I had a few, because I mean it's there's the different sections. Obviously, I think one of the key things for me, and it reminded me that it's something that I was have always had this. I've always been in line with this way of thinking, and that is that we have a society that's pushed to and almost brainwashed to an extent to look a certain way, and with regard to image. And obviously she relates that back to Michael Jackson's ever-changing image, but just this notion that if we obviously are in only our minds and not in our hearts, that there's obviously so much within society that's going to be influencing us to have that negative connotation to anything that doesn't fit society's sort of predetermined idea of what is beautiful. And I think we've seen a shift in that in recent years, but we still see very strong ideas of what we should and shouldn't look like. And many of us have hang-ups about that. And I think that I've always looked at that from outside. I have the ability to look at that from outside myself, if that makes sense. We're all influenced by it, including myself. But, you know, from the outside, you can see that it is a societal problem. That doesn't mean that just because you can see it that you're not influenced by it, if that makes sense. So that was a big one for me that I'd certainly agreed with, and I do believe that when we look at the way that people viewed Michael's changing image, and so many people had such a huge problem with it, such a massive issue with his changing appearance in general, but even specific details in relation to that why do you have such an issue with that? And it really does, when you look at that picture, it really does show a reflection of society that isn't overly glowing, to put it nicely.
Yeah, there's quite a big chunk of the book that talks about Michael's transcendence of gender and race. And of course, when people see a picture of him, and I'm talking about obviously non-fans and particularly haters, you know, the comments that tend to come out of their mouth about his image either relates to his colour, where specifically his colour change, or the fact that he looks androgynous. And people have such an issue with both of those things. But, you know, Lisa says that because we all identify ourselves in certain categories, and because we put ourselves in certain categories, you know, we limit who we are, and we then create we create barriers with other people and with other ideas. So because we have categorized ourselves in box A, we can't then identify ourselves with anyone from box B. And, you know, what she essentially says is that Michael, because he didn't put himself in those boxes, that's why he was able to be this universal person. He was able to relate to everybody of every race, of every culture, of every creed, of every gender. You know, he was everything. And you know, that's why when we look at him as a society and we feel that he acted in certain ways that was abnormal, well, actually, was it abnormal, or are they just the actions of someone who's not actually restricting themselves to these kind of social norms that have been, you know, forced upon us really from a young age? We're told, well, you know, what is your sexuality? You know, even when you do a basic form, you have to tick what is your sexuality, what is your ethnicity, what is your, you know, like, why do we have to identify with one or the other? But we are told that we have to. And that's why when we see someone like Michael Jackson, and I say we as a society, obviously not necessarily us fans, but we're uncomfortable with that. We're uncomfortable with, and obviously there's huge shifts at the moment going on, particularly in well, actually, I don't want to say that because I'm not sure where in the world this is going on. Obviously, I can only speak for here, but you know, there's huge campaigns at the moment towards sort of being gender binary, so not associating with one or the other, and rights for trans people, and so those kind of discussions are really becoming more prevalent in society now. But particularly when Michael was at his most successful and his most famous, these conversations were not part of society, and therefore people just looked at him and said, well, is he male, is he female, is he gay, is he straight, is he black, or is he white? You know, there was never this acceptance of actually, well, why do you have to fit one of these particular categories? Because all that does is, of course, restrict you to other groups and other ways of thinking.
Yeah, and I think on that point, it ties back to where she's that first element of Michael being this, you know, sort of soul or angel that then comes down to deliver this message, and she sort of ties it to, you know, was his soul then given something like vitiligo, so that as painful obviously as all that is, it kind of made him transcend everything because there is that shift. So it's kind of trying to say, you know, yeah, he sort of transcends every single boundary that society sees on things. So Just on one of this, I think it's a little bit earlier, but just one that I think is interesting for anybody who is looking at it. It's on page 253, but it's after where it's following about talking about addictions and things like that. And there's 4 points there, and it's not necessarily about Michael, but I think they're all good for anyone to sort of reflect on. So she mentions things, again, obviously noting it's sort of related to, trying to get sleep through certain ways or painkillers and the emotional pain. This is like, one, what emotional pain do I have? What am I not addressing? What unhealthy things am I doing to suppress or avoid the pain? So drugs, alcohol, smoking, sex work, shopping, overdoing, overeating, over-exercising. And it's basically, again, it's reflecting that all back. People might look at Michael and judge certain things, but see it from what he was trying to do, and he was either going through physical pain, whether it be from the burns or anything, or a huge emotional pain. And we should all look at ourselves and are there things that we're doing? It might not be the same kind of drugs, but I mean, I know a couple of mine that are there, like shopping and overeating and under-exercising, those kind of things, And then it says, am I willing to be honest with myself to my own pain and heal that pain through feeling the pain? And that's partly, again, where when you go into counselling, it's about feeling it and working through that. And then, can I let go of the story of my past? So again, where he says, where I believe I am a victim and in turn forgive myself and others while loving myself into freedom and liberation. So obviously, there's a reflection back, that victim thing. And I don't think she's ever tried to say he felt like he was a complete victim or anything, but it's that, he still had damage from his childhood. So, he maybe needed to work through that and heal it, but obviously it's not such an easy thing to do when you're Michael Jackson and, who can you trust to help you through that? And then the last one she has is, am I worthy and deserving of all that is good in life? And well, the answer should be for all of us. Well, for all of us that are good, there's certain people in the world I don't think are deserving it unless they strictly change their path. But that's an interesting one, just for anybody just reflecting on it and seeing it from a different angle. And then later on in that part 6, page 288 and 289, she does a big list, and this again I think really shows you it's that reflection, because she says to be victim or victor, or to blame or take responsibility, see dark or see light. So again, that focus of, if you look at things negatively, you'll see more negative things and you'll attract more negative things. To embrace or to hate, to befriend or to fight. And there's a big list, and to live or to die, to doubt or to have faith. Those kind of things. And I think, it's really trying to show you, and it's what you'd said, Emma, earlier about, that's what she's expressing here, is how you see Michael is a reflection upon yourself and how you see those things. So I just think that was an interesting sort of list that she's got there, of the sort of different sides that you can look at anything really, and obviously the way you look at him.
Yeah, she says that society should focus on who we are, not what we do. And one of the sort of last things that she says is when she's summarising the reflections. This is on page 288. She quotes a French novelist who says, "We do not see things as they are, we see things as we are." And I think really that if you can kind of summarise the book in one sentence, it would be that. And it's this idea of, well, actually, did we view Michael from an objective point of view, or do we judge others from how we perceive them to be, and based on our beliefs of what's right and wrong and good and bad and how things should or shouldn't be. So yeah, Nicole, any final thoughts or additions?
I wrote down something that I was just in the very last chapter, the eternal message, where Lisa was talking about when she went to see the Immortal World Tour, which I just it reminded me of going myself, and I hadn't really thought about that experience for a while. But she was talking about, how she felt some sadness that he didn't get to sort of complete his mission, and then she felt like she was hearing his voice speak to her. And one of the things that she felt that he was saying to her was that, you know, it was never supposed to happen that way. The mission of healing the world, basically. And then one of the things he said to her was that it was never meant to be me single-handedly. I can't do it. I just, you know, in my mind, I heard the Cry song, and I can't do it by myself. I just heard that lyric in my mind when she said that. And there's just a lot of those little parallels to lyrics in his songs and things like that along the way that were quite, they just stand out along the way.
Yeah, the "Will You Be There" as well really stood out for me, where she connects to that. Yeah, it's. I think what you've just said there is spot on. It just, yeah, all of that there, where he basically, again, sort of taking it slightly back to the Jesus thing, but you know, he could only touch, you know, back in those days there was no sort of media or internet. Jesus could only have an impact on a certain amount, but look how obviously the religion impacts people now. And Michael, I think that's that thing, is, you know, probably way after we've gone, he'll have even bigger impact than he even ever had when he was alive. Because again, he always did reach so many people, but it was through a filter of a narrative that the people on high in media or whatever wanted you to believe. That will sort of, time will have gone, and he'll probably have, his message and everything and his music will reach an awful lot more people without that negative filter on it.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've said on a few occasions we feel the tables are turning and that the next generation will be less influenced because, you know, unfortunately, because he's not here, his name is not getting that constant, you know, bombardment of negativity, I guess. It's really interesting that you was talking about his work and you know, how his kind of message was, you know, came through. And one of the ones that I'd never really even considered or picked up on, I mean, things like "Will You Be There," you can analyze that in so many different ways, and Song is an obvious link to make here. But in chapter 26, she talks about Captain EO, and she says how actually that story symbolizes Michael's role in society, you know, about reflections and getting rid of the ego to become one through love. And then on page 62, which I think is quite a nice quote to end on, she says, like Jesus, Michael came here to this planet, his earthly mission, to send out a major love, to remind us of this one and only truth, that we are love, and in that love we are all one. And again, I think that's a really nice summary of the book and of her sort of narrative and her purpose and the message that she wanted to get out there. So yeah, it was a really different book for us this month. I mean, you know, in previous ones, it's kind of been very much like, okay, this was the timeline and these are the facts and this is what this person said about working with Michael and this is what this person said about growing up with Michael. And I think this was, it came from a very different perspective. But I know, Angie, this was one of the reasons that you were keen to introduce this book to others, because it did give a different perspective. And as we've, you know, discussed a lot in the session, you're not necessarily going to agree with everything. It might actually open your mind up to look at things, including yourself, in a slightly different way.
Yeah, definitely. To be honest, I would have loved this book as a teenager. I think just understanding, because I think, like you said, we may have it all innately, but actually making sense of so much and would have got me sort of looking more at the spirit side a lot earlier in my life. But everything's meant to be as it's meant to be. But yeah, I think it's a great book for that.
I think it's great that it kind of, well, not forces you, but it's very thought-provoking in that it makes you question and reflect on how society is. It made you question and reflect on what Michael was like. And then with me, and the fact that I was having such a strong reaction to chapter 18, I started doing this massive self-reflection on why is that bothering me so much? Like I do feel that the book's kind of encouraged me to look at my own thinking and why I saw it that way. And I had kind of, my own personal thoughts on where that's come from and why it is the way that it is. But it's sort of a self-reflection process reading the book as well. So it's very soulful. It feels like the right word to describe it.
Yeah.
I think what's always frustrating with these books, and it's the same when we discussed Humanitarian last month, we feel like it teaches us so much and it does give us those different perspectives, but it's always, I always feel like it's not us who should be reading it. Like, you want to give this book to a non-fan or someone who's not open to, like, don't get me wrong, with every book that we read, we learn new stuff, and we, even as fans who have been studying him for many, many years, there's always stuff that we're learning, but you just feel like if I could give this book to somebody else who doesn't have any understanding, but then I suppose you have to kind of wonder, it's like what we've been talking about the whole session, if you hold that mirror up, would they be as accepting of it as we have been? And I don't know. I suppose, like you say, Angie, there's always some that do have the potential to listen and change their mind.
And that's a major thing that we all have to do. And Michael, you have to always believe in the light and believe in the good and put your focus to that, because that's where, and the more people that put that out there, it's, don't, with Michael, the more you people who will fight with, and they'll get kind of in a bit of they're not maybe saying the nicest things back. That's not the way to, he's taught us all that. It's not the way to do it. The way is to just keep pushing it out there and push it, like with him. And I did the same. I went down the rabbit hole of fighting the haters, and I'm like, what am I doing? This is not making me feel good in my life. Go back to the good thing. And then, funnily enough, I came across the book club, and I was like, good, something where I can just focus on the good bits and and all that angle of it. It's about refocusing. So, and that then has a much bigger, more powerful impact than any of the other stuff. Things will, if we all do this, and and I think this is obviously Taja's project, is to do this. If we all focus on that, we will put him, once we're all long gone, in such a better place. If we're just putting negativity back out there, we're kind of killing off his positive message. We've got to keep relaying all that side of it to then get people to kind of see what he was trying to tell us all. And like his messages about the earth, absolutely. I mean, and just quickly, I know we were sort of ending, but just quickly on that connection with the child and the earth, I think we've probably all seen it. We're all mothers. A child comes home from school and they're really like, oh my God, Mum, I've just been told about this and the recycling. And I remember being like that as a kid, and I was, trying to help animals, and I became vegetarian. I was really concerned about the planet. And Michael was the one person that was out there that I could connect with on that level. And I think it's about keeping him there so that those people that are looking for that message can find him, and then he helps sort of guide it. And as he said, and she quotes in the book about, this is it. It's not about just thinking, oh, somebody else will sort it out, or a government will sort it out, or it's about sort of doing things yourself and lending towards that kind of changing things and the light, and man in the mirror and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Before we finish up, I just wanted to add one thing about Lisa. I was having a look on her website just before we started, and actually I found a link to her YouTube channel, and there was a bit of a celebration dance because she had her last chemo on the 11th of March. So that's obviously some great news there. So I just wanted to, if she happens to watch this, to continue to wish her well in her journey to a full recovery.
That's exactly what I was going to say at the end.
There we go.
We all wish her well.
We're in sync.
We all wish her well with all of this. I think that's another reason we wanted to do her book now as well. Just, something positive about what she's going through, that not so easy journey.
Absolutely, and thank you for writing the book and contributing to Michael's legacy, and for, you know, giving fans and whoever decides to read the book, as we've said, a you know, something to think about and a different perspective. I think that you're probably going to actually open up a spiritual journey for quite a few people who read this. You know, if they're kind of being introduced to this way of thinking for the first time, I think you might definitely help people to start their path, which is very exciting for them. So focusing on to next month's JIGS session, which I will do a post for with the date, etc. But again, kind of complete opposite really of what we've discussed today. But we're definitely going back to a more objective, factual-based book. This is one that I've been dying to read for ages, and we know that Mike, of course, is in the process of writing, I believe it's kind of an updated version. I wondered whether it was a new book, but I think that it's the same book but with like additional chapters and stuff, if I'm not mistaken. And I know that there's a whole chapter being introduced called Understanding Michael. He did say the chapter name might change, but at the moment that's the chapter name, so I think that's really exciting. So yeah, I thought it'd be really nice to discuss this one before the new one comes out, which we don't have a date yet. I think he's still in the process of writing that. But yeah, this will be the book for next month. So if you don't have a copy, make sure that you go and buy that. It is quite thick. Go on, Angie, sorry.
I was saying you haven't said its title. You've showed it. You haven't said it for anybody else.
I'm sorry. I'm just I'm just assuming everyone's watching, but I suppose people could be listening. Sorry, it's Making Michael by Mike Smallcombe. So yes, I know some people do listen on YouTube and in the car, and they don't have the opportunity to watch. So thank you for that. Yeah, it is quite a thick one. You're looking around sort of 400 pages. So let's get started now. It'll be in about time. What, Angie?
I'm off to do it now. I better start now. It's going to be a tricky one for me to read in a month. Challenge accepted.
Right, so I think that's it. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. Some really lovely comments. We've tried to kind of respond to as many as we can in the comments section and on camera as well. But the comments section of the session will be open even when we finish the broadcast. So if you're kind of watching this at later date and you want to comment, then you can still join in the discussion. But for now, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Bye.